In the shadowed alleys of medieval Europe, while cathedrals reached for the heavens and kings plotted over crowns, a quiet transformation was underway, one that would alter the economic fabric of the continent forever. Amid blood-stained pogroms, papal edicts, and religious tension, a people long persecuted found themselves at the heart of Europe's emerging financial machine: the Jews. But how did a community scattered and often despised rise to wield such economic influence? Was it divine favor or divine punishment that shaped their path? To understand this, we must journey back to a time when Christian doctrine forbade believers from charging interest. Usury, as it was called, was a sin, a stain on the soul. And yet, kingdoms needed loans, cathedrals needed gold, wars needed financing. Into this void stepped the Jewish moneylender, permitted by both church and necessity to do what Christians could not: lend silver at a price. As Christian Europe chained itself to rigid theology, Jewish financiers emerged as indispensable players in the feudal economy. Yet their rising wealth would not shield them from wrath. Across France, England, and the German states, they were expelled, tortured, and massacred. Their ledgers were burned, their gold stolen, their names blackened. So why did they continue to rise? What hidden forces pushed them toward wealth, while others sank into poverty? The answer lies not just in economics, but in Scripture. According to the Quran, the children of Israel were a people chosen, yet punished, blessed with knowledge, yet repeatedly warned. The Holy Book recounts how they broke covenants, altered divine commandments, and were struck by humiliation for their persistent disobedience. As Surah Al-Baqarah 2 verse 61 declares, they were covered with humiliation and misery. They drew on themselves the wrath of Allah. That was because they repeatedly rejected the signs of Allah and killed the prophets without just cause. Is it coincidence then that history repeatedly placed this community in roles that bred envy, resentment, and retribution? This documentary does not seek to vilify, it seeks to unveil. Beneath the gilded myths of wealth lies a story of survival, of punishment, and of divine irony. A tale where riches flowed not from privilege but from prohibition, where power was purchased at the price of persecution, and where the pages of Scripture and history align to reveal a deeper truth, one often hidden beneath the surface. Brace yourself. This is not just a history of economics. This is the story of how a people rose, fell, and rose again, under the weight of divine judgment and historical necessity. A people scattered, exiled from their homeland, reviled by the empires they lived within, yet destined to hold the keys to Europe's economy for centuries. How did the Jewish people, marginalized and often confined to ghettos, come to dominate the medieval world of moneylending, finance, and trade? How did exile transform into enterprise, and suffering into strength? The story is long, layered, and drenched in both divine warning and historical irony. We begin not in Europe, but in the deserts of ancient Palestine, where the foundations of this narrative are laid not in gold, but in revelation. According to the Quran, the children of Israel were once favored above all nations. Surah Al-Baqarah reminds them, "O children of Israel, remember my favor which I bestowed upon you, and that I preferred you over the worlds." They were gifted prophets, divine books, and spiritual leadership. Yet this divine preference came with responsibility, a sacred contract. Time and again, the Quran narrates how the children of Israel broke this covenant. They disobeyed, altered the scriptures, and placed worldly gains above divine commands. The consequences were severe. Allah sent upon them humiliation and punishment, not out of cruelty, but as a reminder of their deviation. In Surah Al-Baqarah, it states, "And they were covered with humiliation and misery, and they drew upon themselves the wrath of Allah. That was because they repeatedly rejected the signs of Allah and killed the prophets without just cause. That was because they disobeyed and transgressed beyond bounds." These spiritual failures did not go unpunished in the world. Time and again, Bani Israel were conquered, enslaved, scattered, and yet they also endured. Their resilience became both a blessing and a burden. By the time of the medieval Christian world, the Jewish people had been displaced repeatedly, from Babylon to Rome, from Judea to Iberia. With the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, they became a people without a homeland. In Christian Europe, they were seen as outsiders, both ethnically and religiously. The Church viewed them as the people who had rejected the Messiah, and so they became theological enemies within Christian society. But theological hatred alone does not explain what happened next. The medieval European world was, in every sense, a religious civilization. The Catholic Church did not just rule the spiritual domain. It ruled kings, dictated laws, and shaped economies. One of its core teachings was a prohibition on usury, the charging of interest on loans. Based on interpretations of biblical verses, it was considered sinful for Christians to lend money at interest. Yet commerce was growing. Kingdoms needed credit. Nobles needed loans for wars. Cities needed financing to expand. And into this void, out of both exclusion and opportunity, stepped the Jews. Denied land ownership, barred from guilds, and restricted from farming or holding high office, Jews were forced into narrow economic lanes. One of the few avenues left to them was money lending. And because they were not Christians, they were not bound by the Church's prohibition on interest. This made them both necessary and hated. Jewish communities became essential to European economies, lending money to nobles, merchants, even monarchs. They facilitated trade, built credit systems, and introduced early forms of banking. But their rising financial role didn't earn them respect. It earned them suspicion, resentment, and fury. The image of the rich Jew, with coins in one hand and ledgers in the other, was born not out of greed, but out of necessity. They were pushed into these roles by a system that would not allow them to do anything else. The Church's stance on usury was uncompromising for Christians, but Christian rulers quickly realized that money lending was essential. Wars could not be waged without it. Cathedrals could not be built without financing. So a loophole emerged. Let the Jews do it. In doing so, Christian rulers created a financial class that was both indispensable and vulnerable. Jews were granted protection, temporarily. Monarchs issued charters allowing them to lend money in exchange for high taxes and forced loans. But when public anger rose, or the king needed cash, those same Jews were expelled, their assets seized, and their communities slaughtered. This cycle repeated across Europe. England, 1290. All Jews expelled by Edward I after years of forced taxation and rising anti-Jewish riots. France, 1182, 1306, and again in 1394. Jews expelled multiple times by monarchs seeking to seize their wealth. Germany, waves of pogroms during the Crusades, Black Death, and beyond. Their economic usefulness was always overshadowed by the religious and social hate that festered beneath the surface. Here, the Quran offers an eerie parallel. In Surah An-Nisa, for Allah says, "Because of the wrongdoing of the Jews, we forbade them good things which were once lawful to them, and because they hindered many from Allah's way, and because they took usury, though they had been forbidden from it, and because they devoured people's wealth unjustly." According to Islamic interpretation, the act of taking interest, which they were specifically warned against, became both a sin and a punishment. It bound them to wealth in a way that attracted envy and divine displeasure. The Quran does not merely criticize them for usury. It frames their economic entanglement as part of a divine consequence. In this view, their rise in financial power was not necessarily a blessing, but a means of humiliation and trial.
Throughout the medieval period, Jewish communities in Europe walked a tightrope between royal courts and angry mobs. On one day, they were protected by a king who needed their financing. On another, they were the victims of brutal massacres when debts piled up and the crown needed a scapegoat. In some cities, they were required to wear distinctive badges. In others, they were locked into ghettos at night. In many, they were forbidden from owning property, yet were taxed more than the nobles who owned entire villages. Yet despite it all, they adapted. They developed sophisticated financial systems, trained generations of bankers, and built networks that extended across countries. They passed down financial literacy in a time when most Christians could not read. They documented contracts, invented credit notes, and taught bookkeeping long before the Medici made it fashionable. It was not wealth they pursued, but survival. To the outsider, a Jewish banker in medieval Europe looked powerful, but his position was perilous. His wealth was temporary. His success could be reversed with one edict. His life could end with one mob. This is the paradox at the heart of the Jewish economic identity. They were forced into finance, then blamed for being in it. Islamic scholars have long debated whether this was a punishment or simply a historic consequence of their actions. Some see it as both. A people who once defied prophets were now forced to navigate a world that would always resent their role, no matter how vital it was. From the Islamic perspective, one could argue that what befell Bani Israel in medieval Europe was not merely history, it was divine history. Their fate was not random, but part of a larger pattern. When people turn away from revelation, when they twist moral codes, and when they prioritize wealth over faith, then even wealth becomes a test. Even survival becomes a form of judgment. Yet, the story isn't one of destruction, it's one of transformation. Jews, despite all odds, despite divine punishment and human hatred, endured. They survived crusades, expulsions, inquisitions, ghettos, and plagues. And through it all, they built a financial legacy that would shape the world's economies for centuries. Europe in the Middle Ages was a continent of cathedrals, cloisters, and crusades. Religion governed all, how people lived, who they could marry, what they could eat, and even what they could do with their money. And nowhere was the church's influence more ironclad than in its war against usury, the lending of money at interest. In Christian doctrine, usury was not just discouraged. It was a mortal sin, but while theology forbade it, reality demanded it. Empires needed financing, monarchs needed to borrow, merchants needed capital. So when Christians could not lend, someone else had to. Enter the Jews. From the earliest church councils, the Christian world viewed interest-bearing loans as fundamentally immoral. Citing passages from the Bible such as Luke 6:35, lend expecting nothing in return, and Deuteronomy 23:19, you shall not charge interest on loans to your brother. Theologians argued that profiting from another's need was exploitation and therefore sinful. By the 12th century, church law made it clear no Christian could charge interest. Doing so was a form of theft, a moral corruption. Those who practiced usury were denied Christian burial and could be excommunicated. Theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas reinforced this view. He argued that money was sterile. Unlike land or cattle, it could not reproduce. To take profit from it was unnatural, a violation of divine law. But the economy didn't share these views. Europe was changing. By the 11th century, feudal economies began shifting toward commerce. Cities like Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Paris became trade hubs. Markets expanded, merchants traveled, shipping increased, but trade required credit. Long-distance commerce needed investors. Kings who wanted armies needed funding. And yet the Christian system had built a world where money could not move freely. This created a contradiction at the heart of Christendom, the theological refusal of interest versus the practical need for it. The solution: outsource the sin. Jews were not bound by Christian canon law. While the Old Testament prohibits charging interest to fellow Jews, Exodus 22:25, it allows lending to non-Jews. The Talmud, though cautious about exploitation, does not outright forbid lending with interest to outsiders. Thus, in Christian kingdoms, Jews became the only legal avenue for credit. But this was not empowerment. It was entrapment. Christian kings didn't invite Jews to participate in the economy out of generosity. They used them as legal tools. Jews were issued royal charters, special documents that gave them protection in exchange for financial services. These charters often allowed them to lend money to Christians, operate pawn shops or engage in trade, be protected from mob violence, live in separate quarters under royal control. In return, the monarch taxed them heavily. Sometimes, taxes reached up to 1/3 of Jewish income. Other times, kings demanded forced loans, repayable at the king's whim or not at all. Thus, Jews were placed in an economic position that was both essential and exploitative. They became the bankers Europe needed, but never welcomed. One of the most striking examples comes from medieval England. Jews first arrived in England after the Norman conquest of 1066. William the Conqueror invited them, recognizing their financial utility. By the 12th century, they were deeply embedded in English financial life. They lent to barons, bishops, and even the crown. Records from the time show that Jews financed castles, monastic lands, and royal campaigns. The most famous Jewish financier, Aaron of Lincoln, had a personal fortune said to rival the crown's treasury, but resentment brewed. Because Jews were often the only ones legally allowed to collect debts, and because those debts often came with harsh terms, they became targets of public fury. They were blamed for economic hardship, demonized by church sermons, and vilified in popular stories. In 1190, the worst anti-Jewish massacre in England occurred in York, where an entire Jewish community was burned alive in Clifford's Tower by a mob enraged by debts and rumors of blood libel. Finally, in 1290, King Edward I expelled all Jews from England. Their properties were seized, debts cancelled, and centuries of Jewish presence erased in one edict. It would be nearly 400 years before Jews returned to England under Oliver Cromwell. France followed a similar pattern. Kings like Philip Augustus and Philip IV welcomed Jews for their financial services, then expelled them once the money changed hands. In 1182, Jews were expelled from Paris and their property seized. They were allowed back in 1198 under new taxation agreements. In 1306, Philip IV expelled them again and confiscated their wealth. By 1394, Jews were expelled from all of France. This pattern, invite, tax, exploit, expel, would be repeated throughout Europe. It was not just about money, it was about control. All of this was made easier by religious narrative. Christian preachers did not simply condemn interest, they personalized the condemnation. The Jewish lender became a symbol of greed, corruption, and anti-Christian values. This is when the figure of the wandering Jew, or the Jewish usurer, became embedded in European folklore and sermons. He was no longer just a banker. He was the betrayer of Christ, the enemy within, the puppet master of Christian suffering. These depictions had real consequences. When economic tensions rose, mobs targeted Jewish quarters. When kings defaulted on loans, they allowed pogroms. When the Black Death struck, Jews were accused of poisoning wells. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Jewish communities in Italy and parts of Germany were forced into ghettos, walled districts where they had to live, often under curfew, often marked by yellow badges. And yet, they continued to lend. They had to. Denied access to other professions, land, or political rights, money lending remained one of the few survival routes. Ironically, Christian rulers often mandated that Jews continue lending because it served the economy. In some cities, Jews were even ordered to operate pawn shops. Thus, Jews were vilified for lending, but were punished if they stopped. It's critical to understand. Most Jews did not seek this role out of ambition. They were funneled into it by a system that gave them no choice. They could not become knights or clergy. They could not own farms or join guilds. They could not rise through Christian courts or law. Finance was their only path, not to power, but to mere existence. What began as a loophole became a label, and once labeled as moneylenders, Jews were seen only through the lens of gold. Their scholars, poets, rabbis, and mystics were forgotten in Christian eyes. What remained was the caricature, the usurer, the puppet master, the villain. Wealth is a test, power is a trial, and for those who once received divine favor, the fall from grace is often the most severe. So warns the Quran repeatedly when it speaks of the children of Israel, known in Arabic as Bani Israel. Their story, told across numerous chapters, is not just history. It is moral theology. It is spiritual warning. It is a divine mirror held up to the world, reflecting how a chosen people, gifted with revelation and miracles, became a community bound by worldly pursuits, disobedience, and eventually, humiliation. The Quran acknowledges the unique status Bani Israel once held. Surah Al-Baqarah 2:122 states clearly, "O children of Israel, remember my favor which I bestowed upon you, and that I preferred you over the worlds." No other nation received such favor. They were delivered from Pharaoh by Musa, Moses. They were fed manna and salwa, heavenly food. They witnessed the sea parted, the staff transformed, the mountain raised above them. And yet, this spiritual privilege did not guarantee obedience. Time and again, the Quran describes how they turned away. They demanded to see Allah directly. They worshipped the golden calf. They altered divine scriptures. They hid truth for profit. And they repeatedly killed prophets sent to them. In Surah Al-Baqarah 261, Allah declares, "And they were covered with humiliation and misery. They drew upon themselves the wrath of Allah. That was because they disbelieved in the signs of Allah and killed the prophets unjustly. That was because they disobeyed and were transgressors." Here begins the Quranic portrait of Bani Israel as a case study in how divine favor can become divine anger when truth is betrayed. Perhaps one of the gravest violations mentioned is the practice of riba, interest or usury. Surah An-Nisa 4160-161. For wrongdoing on the part of the Jews, we made unlawful for them certain good foods which had been lawful to them, and for their taking of usury while they had been forbidden from it, and for their wrongful appropriation of people's wealth. We have prepared for the disbelievers among them a painful punishment. This verse is critical for several reasons. It confirms that interest was already forbidden to them, not just later communities. It ties usury directly to divine punishment, in both law and worldly suffering. It links economic corruption with moral and spiritual decline. According to traditional Islamic exegesis, tafsir, this was not merely a financial sin, it was a sign that wealth had overtaken revelation in their hearts. To fully grasp the Quranic judgment, we must understand the moral logic of Islamic economics. In Islam, wealth is not evil, but it must be purified. Money cannot be made from money. It must be invested, risked, or earned through effort. Interest is condemned because it enables the rich to get richer without risk, while trapping the poor in debt. Surah Al-Baqarah 2275 warns, "Those who consume interest cannot stand on Judgment Day, except as one whom Satan has driven to madness." When the Quran accuses Bani Israel of engaging in interest despite divine prohibition, it is accusing them of breaking a moral economy in favor of a predatory one. By the time Jews entered the Christian financial world, the ancient prohibitions of usury had become largely ignored or circumvented. As explored in earlier chapters, Jews were often forced into financial roles because Christian law barred interest, but the Quran frames this as part of their spiritual fall. What's striking is that the Quran doesn't limit this sin to Bani Israel alone. It condemns anyone who engages in interest, but it draws special attention to those who had received previous scriptures and still transgressed. In that context, Jewish dominance in financial systems during medieval times is not seen as success, but as a divine irony. The very thing they were forbidden to do became their survival strategy. But with that came divine consequence. One of the Quran's consistent descriptions of Bani Israel's punishment is dispersal, humiliation, and perpetual insecurity. Surah Al-A'raf 7:168. "And we cut them into sections on the earth. Some of them were righteous, and some were otherwise. And we tested them with good and bad that perhaps they would return." This verse captures a multi-layered punishment: division and diaspora, social humiliation, cycles of suffering and reprieve. Ibn Kathir note that this dispersion, being scattered across the world, was not merely political. It was a spiritual exile, a sign that the community had lost its divine protection due to disobedience. And history reflects this. From Babylon to Rome, from Spain to Germany, Jews were expelled, resettled, expelled again, and driven into professions that kept them constantly resented and vulnerable. Their material survival often came at the cost of religious compromise, a punishment that echoed precisely what the Quran had described centuries earlier. But this chapter is not simply a judgment on Jews. The Quran's story of Bani Israel is a warning to the Ummah of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Surah Al-Jumu'ah 62.5 makes this parallel explicit. The example of those who were entrusted with the Torah and then did not uphold it is like that of a donkey carrying books. Here, the Quran warns Muslims, Knowledge alone does not save you. Carrying scripture without obedience is worthless. And those who had divine knowledge before you were not destroyed for ignorance but for arrogance. Thus, the Quran's portrayal of Bani Israel is not just historical, it is prophetic. It is a mirror held up to future communities, warning them not to repeat the same pattern: favor, disobedience, downfall. They were feared, loathed, expelled, and yet inevitably invited back. In medieval Europe, the Jewish people found themselves in an ever-shifting position of power and peril. Though their financial acumen had made them indispensable to monarchs, they were also an easy scapegoat during times of social unrest and economic hardship. Their connection to lending, especially usury, was both the source of their utility and the root of their persecution. This chapter explores the paradoxical world in which Jews lived under Christian rule, where princes employed them to finance wars and cathedrals, but mobs burned their homes and synagogues, where the same monarch who protected them for taxes could expel them when politically convenient, where wealth flowed, but so did blood. As Christian Europe evolved from the early medieval period to the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had firm control over moral and social doctrines. Among its strongest prohibitions was against usury, the charging of interest on loans. Deemed a mortal sin, usury was seen as theft and exploitation, particularly of the poor. However, the need for credit did not vanish with its condemnation. Monarchs needed loans to fund crusades and wars. Merchants needed capital to expand trade, and the nobility was often heavily indebted due to lavish expenditures. With Christians barred from lending with interest, rulers turned to the Jews, a community already marginalized and lacking many civil rights, to act as the financial middlemen of Christendom. But this legal exception came at a cost. Jews were used as both tools and targets. Their function as lenders made them visibly connected to the financial burdens of common Christians, which only added fuel to the anti-Semitic stereotype of the greedy Jew. The Church's theological framing of Jews as the killers of Christ further radicalized public hatred, intertwining religious contempt with economic resentment. By the 11th and 12th centuries, kings across Europe had discovered how profitable it was to both protect and extort their Jewish subjects. In England, Jews were declared direct property of the crown, a legal status that both protected them from general legal jurisdiction and allowed the monarch to tax them heavily. King Henry II of England, for instance, formalized the role of Jews in financial affairs, ensuring that records of loans were kept in the exchequer of the Jews. This systematization turned Jewish moneylending into an institutional arm of the state. But with state dependency came vulnerability. When a monarch needed funds, he could simply levy new taxes on the Jewish community or confiscate property under dubious legal claims. In France, under King Philip IV, often remembered for destroying the Knights Templar, Jews faced similar cycles of utility and persecution. He expelled them in 1306, seizing their assets, only to readmit them later for their economic benefit. This pattern would be seen again and again across the continent. Pogroms, violent riots aimed at the massacre or expulsion of Jews, became a tragic staple of Jewish life in Christian Europe. They were often triggered by conspiracy theories, blood libels, or simply economic envy. In 1096, as the First Crusade began, mobs in the Rhineland attacked Jewish communities, believing it a divine mission to purge non-Christians from European soil before heading to Jerusalem. Entire communities were wiped out in cities like Mainz, Speyer, and Worms. These were not just attacks. They were mass murders carried out with religious fervor, often with little resistance from authorities. The Black Death in the 14th century provided another flashpoint. As the plague decimated Europe's population, rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells. Despite the Church's occasional efforts to quash these claims, thousands of Jews were burned alive, drowned, or driven into exile across hundreds of towns. The plague had killed indiscriminately, but the survivors needed a scapegoat. The irony: many Jews had survived early stages of the plague by practicing better hygiene through ritual purity laws, which made them appear suspicious to unknowing neighbors. By the 15th century, Jews in many parts of Europe were increasingly isolated, physically as well as socially. The concept of the ghetto emerged in Venice in 1516, where Jews were required to live in a walled part of the city and locked in at night. Other cities followed suit. These restrictions were not merely spatial, they were economic and cultural. Jews were barred from joining most guilds, excluded from owning land, and limited in the trades they could enter. As a result, they were again pushed toward money lending, pawnbroking, and commerce, further entrenching the cycle of stereotype and persecution. Despite these barriers, Jewish communities found ways to preserve their culture, educate their youth, and develop networks of trade and scholarship across borders. The ghettos became both prisons and sanctuaries. While most Jews lived in fear and isolation, some achieved remarkable influence by serving directly in royal courts. These court Jews were typically financiers, diplomats, or physicians whose services were so valuable that they were granted special protection and privileges. Notable among them was Yossel of Rothschild, a 16th century Jewish advocate in the Holy Roman Empire, who negotiated with emperors and defended Jewish communities from violent accusations and forced conversions. In Spain, Samuel Hanagid rose to become vizier and general under a Muslim ruler in Granada during a time of relative tolerance. These rare figures demonstrate that despite rampant persecution, the intellectual and financial talents of Jewish individuals continued to find ways into corridors of power. But their fates were often precarious, dependent entirely on the goodwill of the ruling elite. The Quran speaks repeatedly of the children of Israel being punished for transgressions, particularly for distorting the message, killing prophets, and engaging in usury despite divine prohibition, and for their taking of usury while they had been forbidden from it, and their consuming of people's wealth unjustly. And we have prepared for the disbelievers among them a painful punishment. Quran 4:161. But because of their breaking of their covenant, we cursed them and made their hearts hard. Quran 5:13. For believers, these verses foreshadow the cyclical nature of Jewish punishment in history, not as an ethnic condemnation, but as a moral and spiritual lesson. Time and again, when wealth became a tool of oppression or arrogance, divine justice intervened. The suffering of Jews throughout history, through pogroms and expulsions, echoes what the Quran warned of when a people turns away from divine guidance for material gain. And yet, this must be understood within a nuanced framework. The Quran also recognizes the diversity among the children of Israel. They are not all the same. Among the people of the book is a community standing in obedience, reciting the verses of Allah during periods of the night and prostrating in prayer. Quran 3:113. The word ghetto itself has Jewish origins. The first officially designated Jewish ghetto was established in Venice in 1516 in the Cannaregio district. It was surrounded by canals, locked at night, and guarded by Christian patrols. Jews were only allowed to work in specific trades: medicine, second-hand goods, textiles, and, of course, money lending. This separation was both punitive and protective. For Christian rulers, ghettos served to contain a foreign faith. But for the Jews, the walls became zones of cultural preservation. Within them, the Hebrew language, Torah study, and rabbinic debate flourished. Though caged, the Jewish spirit remained unbroken, and it was within these very walls that Jews perfected the skills which Christian society needed but resented: accounting, lending, brokerage, and market speculation. These ghettos would birth generations of intellectuals, financiers, and political thinkers who would change the world. As persecution intensified in Western Europe, particularly in Spain, Portugal, and parts of Italy, many Jews migrated eastward into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, parts of Ukraine, and the Ottoman Empire. By the 17th century, Poland had become the largest center of Jewish life in the world. Nobles in Poland welcomed Jews as administrators, tax collectors, leaseholders, and traders. Jewish communities became crucial intermediaries between the peasant population and the aristocracy. They ran taverns, collected taxes, and even administered estates. In exchange, they were granted autonomy. Jews governed themselves under the Council of Four Lands, Va'ad Arba Aratzot, developing robust legal systems and schools. The Jewish economy in Eastern Europe became layered and sophisticated, from village-level traders to urban financiers. But it was a fragile existence.
again dependent on the goodwill of rulers and the tolerance of the majority. When the Khmelnytsky uprising broke out in 1648, tens of thousands of Jews were massacred. Prosperity had again led to backlash, and divine tests returned with fire and sword. While Europe brutalized its Jews, many found safety and dignity under Muslim rule. The Ottoman Empire, especially under Sultan Bayezid II, welcomed the Jews expelled from Spain in 1492. "You call Ferdinand a wise king," Bayezid mocked. "He impoverishes his kingdom and enriches mine." In Istanbul, Salonika, and Izmir, Jews thrived. They were traders on the Silk Road, court physicians, mint masters, and interpreters. Jewish merchants linked Ottoman markets with Europe and Asia. Hebrew printing presses spread ideas. Sephardic culture blossomed under the shadow of the Crescent. Islamic law forbade usury, but Muslim rulers still used Jewish financiers as intermediaries to circumvent Sharia in statecraft and war. Thus, Jewish financial expertise remained a strategic asset. Though still dhimmi non-Muslim subjects, their relative security and autonomy in the Islamic world contrasted sharply with the relentless suspicion they faced in Europe. As Spain and Portugal burned their Jews under the Inquisition, some conversos Jews forced to convert to Christianity fled north to Holland, particularly to Amsterdam, a young Protestant republic defined by religious tolerance, global trade, and capitalist innovation. Here, Jews could finally live openly. They founded synagogues, schools, and banks. Amsterdam's Jewish financiers became instrumental in funding the Dutch East India Company, underwriting colonial ventures and managing silver shipments from the Americas to Europe. The city soon earned the title Jerusalem of the West. Here, Jewish resilience transformed into strategy. Jewish traders understood currency exchanges, trade routes, commodity speculation, and, importantly, how to network across continents through family ties. They spoke Ladino, Hebrew, Dutch, Spanish, Arabic, a linguistic web tied to commerce. The Dutch Golden Age was a Jewish Golden Age as well. Jews were no longer simply adapting to Christian economies. They were building their own. All this material success, however, was not unmoored from faith. While the secular world watched Jewish bankers rise internally, Jewish leaders interpreted this success through a theological lens. Wealth was not a blessing, it was a trial. Rabbinic literature warned constantly against assimilation, pride, and the illusion of permanence. Exile is not over, they taught. We are rich today, but we are still under divine punishment. The Kabbalistic revival in Seift on Israel emphasized the spiritual significance of Jewish suffering. Later, the Hasidic movement in Eastern Europe refocused Jewish identity on joy, worship, and spiritual resilience, especially for the poor. These movements kept the community grounded, reminding them that the ultimate redemption would not come from coins or credit, but from returning to Allah. By the late 18th century, a seismic shift began in Europe: the Enlightenment. For Jews, this meant the Haskalah, a Jewish intellectual movement calling for integration into modern society, education in secular sciences, and the abandonment of ghetto restrictions. As Napoleon marched across Europe, he tore down ghetto walls and declared Jews citizens. In Germany, France, and Italy, Jews were allowed into universities, professions, and public office. But assimilation came at a cost: identity. Some Jews abandoned religious dress, stopped keeping kosher, and began intermarrying. Others used this new freedom to enter banking, law, and publishing. The Rothschilds rose during this era, creating an international financial empire from Frankfurt to Paris, London to Vienna. But emancipation did not erase hatred. In fact, it made Jewish wealth and influence more visible and more threatening to the masses. Conspiracies began to form. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, blood libels, economic accusations, all intensified. Resilience was still needed, but now it was mental, cultural, and political. The 18th and 19th centuries were an era of vast upheaval and transformation. Europe was in the throes of industrialization, revolution, and empire building. In the middle of this great reshuffling, a name began to surface, one that would become synonymous with wealth, power, secrecy, and finance: Rothschild.
But the story of the Rothschilds is not simply the tale of one family. It is the story of how Jewish financiers, long marginalized, stepped into the heart of European power structures, and how their rise was both facilitated and vilified by the same societies that had once excluded them. To understand the Rothschild story, one must first grasp the seismic shifts happening in Europe during the late 1700s. The Enlightenment had begun to crack open the rigid social orders of old Europe, while Jewish communities had long been confined to ghettos, barred from owning land, and taxed for simply existing. Enlightenment thinkers and emerging liberal states began to champion ideas of civil equality and religious tolerance. This created a new window of opportunity, not full acceptance, but permission to participate. Finance was one of the few arenas where Jewish families could compete. In many Christian-majority nations, the charging of interest on loans, usury, had long been condemned by the church. But by the 18th century, this restriction had softened for Christians, and the field of high finance became more legitimate and institutional. Still, Jewish communities had a centuries-old legacy in handling credit, letters of exchange, and capital. Skills honed in the shadows of European economies, and now brought into the light. The Rothschild dynasty begins with Meyer Amschel Rothschild, born in 1744 in Frankfurt's Judengasse, a cramped and heavily restricted Jewish ghetto. From modest beginnings as a coin dealer and money changer, Meyer's fortunes rose through a combination of shrewd networking and political foresight. He ingratiated himself with Prince William of Hesse, one of the wealthiest men in Europe, managing and multiplying his vast fortunes. What made Meyer unique was his vision. He wasn't content with local operations. He had 5 sons and trained them not only in finance, but in secrecy, discipline, and loyalty to the family enterprise. Meyer sent his sons to 5 major European cities: Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, forming what became known as the 5 Arrows, each representing a branch of the family business. This decentralized model, held together by coded correspondence, family marriage, and a common agenda, became a financial empire unlike anything Europe had ever seen. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, tested the mettle of European finance. Wars were no longer just fought with swords and muskets. They were won with money. Armies had to be fed, ships built, alliances bribed. It was during this time that the Rothschilds began their true ascent. Nathan Mayer Rothschild, stationed in London, played a pivotal role. He organized complex cross-border financial transactions, managed the transfer of gold to fund the British war effort, and set up intelligence networks faster than governments could dream of. One of the most famous, though often exaggerated, in stories is that of Waterloo. According to legend, Nathan received news of Napoleon's defeat before the British government and used this information to manipulate the stock market. While scholars debate the accuracy, what is true is this: after Waterloo, the Rothschilds had proven themselves indispensable to European powers. By the end of the war, Nathan was one of the most powerful men in Britain. He once declared, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the money supply." Though apocryphal, the quote captured public sentiment. The Rothschilds were no longer bankers, they were kingmakers. As the 19th century progressed, Rothschild wealth funded the building of railways, the founding of banks, the underwriting of governments, and even the creation of modern nations. The Rothschilds financed the Suez Canal, one of the most strategic assets of the British Empire. They backed mining operations in South Africa, rail networks in Austria, and even helped establish central banks in countries across Europe. But with visibility came suspicion. As the Rothschilds' power expanded, so too did resentment. In a Europe still deeply anti-Semitic, the idea that Jews now had control over national treasuries was a source of both paranoia and conspiracy. Cartoons, pamphlets, and speeches depicted them as shadowy manipulators, whispering into the ears of monarchs and pulling strings behind the scenes. Yet the truth was far more nuanced. The Rothschilds operated in a fragile balance. They served empires, but were never truly accepted by them. Despite their wealth, they were often denied noble titles, excluded from elite clubs, and subject to laws targeting Jews. Their immense power did not shield them from racism, it often amplified it. One hallmark of the Rothschild strategy was secrecy. While other banking houses chased glory and publicity, the Rothschilds preferred discretion. Their letters were written in code, their partnerships kept in the family, and their motives hidden from public view. This secrecy helped protect their wealth, but it also fueled myths. Who were these bankers who never gave interviews, never explained their investments, yet seemed to be behind every major European project? The family emphasized unity and continuity. Even when members disagreed, disputes were settled privately. They also pioneered early risk management, avoiding over-leveraging and diversifying across continents and industries. But the greatest challenge came not from markets, but from time. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, new financial powers were emerging. American industrialists like J.P. Morgan Rockefeller and Carnegie began to eclipse the old European banking families. The Rothschilds remained wealthy, but the era of dynastic control over global finance was drawing to a close. The 20th century saw a terrifying transformation. As Europe descended into fascism and anti-Semitism, the Rothschild name, once a symbol of financial innovation, became a focal point for hate. Nazi propaganda frequently invoked the family as evidence of a global Jewish conspiracy. False claims about Rothschild control over central banks, wars, and revolutions became central to anti-Semitic ideologies. Even today, long-debunked conspiracy theories persist in some circles, that the Rothschilds control all world banks, that they engineer conflicts for profit, or that they're part of a secret global order. These myths, while powerful, are divorced from the historical record. In truth, many Rothschild branches lost power, were nationalized, or fled fascist regimes in the 20th century. Their wealth remains, but the narrative of all controlling overlords is a distortion born from centuries of fear, jealousy, and scapegoating. From ancient scriptures to medieval moneylenders, from exile and persecution to dynasties that reshaped global finance. This documentary has peeled back the layers of history, myth, faith, and economics to uncover one of the most complex stories in human civilization. But the journey doesn't end here. If this documentary challenged what you thought you knew, hit that like button, drop a comment below. We want to hear your voice.